Scaffism. Scaffism involves a person being force-fed milk and honey past their normal limits. This goes on until the victim swells like a balloon. But weight gain is the least of the victim's worries here because it only gets much worse than that. The victim is tied to 2 boats, covered with more milk and honey, and taken to a swampy area with countless insects looking for their next meal. The smell of milk and honey made these hungry swamp creatures look at the victim as a buffet table. The victim is left for days as bugs and creatures eat through their skin and flesh. But it gets darker than that because the executioners return to force feed them more milk and honey in what is a drawn-out punishment. Rinse and repeat for a few hours, and we have a victim who's basically being eaten alive by insects and rotting from infection. The rack. The majority of the time, punishment wasn't always about killing someone outright in ancient and medieval times, but rather getting confessions out of criminals. And the rack was the go-to device for anyone in feudal England who was suspected of anything, from heresy, witchcraft, or even just being Catholic. The scene involves a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at the ends. The person being punished has their ankles and wrists tied to these rollers, then someone operates a crank that tightens the ropes attached to the rollers, stretching the victim's body. It's like a tug of war, but with the bones and joints being stretched out as far as possible. As the ropes tighten, the victim experiences intense pain as their body is stretched beyond its natural limits. It's excruciating, but not necessarily lethal. It's just enough to coerce any confession out of them, even if it wasn't true, as the victims would obviously want the pain to end. However, even if someone confesses, their punishment isn't over. The rack can leave them with disfigured limbs and bones, especially if they don't confess quickly enough. So while it may not kill you outright, it indeed ensures a lifetime of suffering for those subjected to it. Flaying. Flaying is one of the oldest forms of punishment in mankind's history because there are documented cases from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. The punishment involves someone's skin getting removed, similar to how animals are skinned before they're cooked. But instead of killing the person before skinning them, flaying involves removing their skin while they are still alive. Of course, the agony doesn't even start there because the victims are boiled before they are flayed to make their skin and flesh softer. It's a pretty brutal scene that's meant to maximize pain. The executioners use sharp knives to steadily work their way through the person's skin, causing immense pain to the victim. People undergoing flaying usually die from shock because of the unbearable pain, but they can also die from infections as well because their flesh is exposed. While it was mainly a method of execution, it was also a way to scare other people from doing the same thing because the flayed victim, dead or alive, is usually hung in a public area where the locals can see what can potentially happen to them if they were brave enough to cross the line. Maming. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest sets of laws, is well known for its famous phrase, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." But this wasn't just a saying at the time, it was taken very literally. During those times, punishment often meant physical harm or bodily injury, and it was all about making the punishment fit the crime. So if someone gouged out another person's eye, they'd lose their eye in return. If someone were caught stealing, they'd lose their hands, the tools they used for thievery. And yes, if someone committed a sexual assault, you can guess what part of their anatomy might be at risk. Sometimes maiming became a brutal method of punishment that had nothing to do with the specific crime committed. It turned into a gruesome form of torture where authorities would systematically chop off body parts until the victim confessed to whatever they were accused of. It was a brutal system where the severity of the punishment often matched the severity of the crime and sometimes even went beyond it. The Brazen Bowl. In 570 BC in ancient Greece, a craftsman was hired by Pherolus, a cruel ruler who wanted a unique way of punishing criminals. And perhaps to give you an idea of what kind of man he was, he said this about them being tortured in the Brazen Bowl. "His screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowings." Pherolus came up with a bronze device shaped like a bowl. The Brazen Bowl looked like any old metal cow, but became one of that era's darkest creations. When they wanted to execute someone, they stuffed that person into the bowl and lit a fire underneath. This means that this metal bowl wasn't made to cook a steak dinner, but to cook people instead. The flames under the bronze contraption would heat the entire bowl up, causing the person inside to cook steadily and slowly while they're screaming in agony. But the Brazen Bowl wasn't just to execute people, because Feralus also wanted it to be entertaining. The bowl was rigged using a system of pipes that made the gadget sound like a real bowl whenever the person inside was screaming for their life. Impalement. Impalement involves a long wooden stake planted firmly on the ground. Meanwhile, a person accused of a crime is forced onto this stake, which slowly enters through the victim's butthole. Gravity takes over as the victim's weight pushes them down while the stake makes its way through their insides. It causes the worst pain imaginable, and the worst part is that it is a slow and painful death that doesn't immediately kill a person until the wooden stake goes through their vital organs or forces the victim to bleed to death. The stake usually exits through the mouth or the chest, turning the victim into a human kebab, but by that time, the victim would already be long dead. The bodies of the victims are usually laid across the field to instill fear into anyone who dares to cross the authorities or break the law. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel has spokes with the victim's body tied to it. Meanwhile, the executioners spin the wheel while another guy smashes the victim with a large hammer, all in front of a crowd. But the point of this punishment was not to kill the victim right off the bat, but to make them suffer. The first phase of breaking the wheel focuses more on breaking the victim's limbs, but the executioners take it to a new level in the second phase by lighting a fire under the wheel, burning the victim as they spin, all while the executioner keeps whacking them with a hammer. There were cases when the executioner finished the job in the second phase by bashing the victim's skull, but there are times when the person is left beaten and broken for days, being left to endure harsh weather conditions and hungry animals, or hoisted on top as a warning to others. Lingchi. Known as death by 1,000 cuts, Lingchi dates back to China's Qing dynasty when it was reserved only for the worst crimes, such as murder and treason. The punishment involved using sharp blades to cut parts of the body methodically. The cuts themselves weren't meant to kill because they were just minor flesh wounds, but when numbered in the hundreds or even the thousands, these wounds can cause immense pain. There were cases where the executions would make the experience worse by throwing dirty water onto the victim to infect their wounds. If the victim doesn't die from wounds, they can bleed to death. But there were instances where the victims would die from shock. China took hundreds of years to abolish the practice, officially outlawing it in 1905. Out of more than 1,000 people subjected to this punishment, the record books say that around 70 of them were put to death. Stoning. Stoning, also called lapidation, was a brutal method of capital punishment. It's a straightforward way of sentencing someone to death without complicated machinery or methods. All it required were stones. The punishment involves people hurling stones at someone until they succumb to the injuries. These stones aren't massive enough to instantly kill or inflict significant harm, but they inflict enough pain to lead to death eventually. The victim has to endure a barrage of stones until shock or blunt force trauma takes their life. But what makes it worse is that it is done in front of the public, humiliating the victim before killing them. Stoning was often reserved for severe offenses like adultery or blasphemy. Locals would usually carry out the punishment, believing that the community should have a say in matters of morality and justice. Rat torture. Rats are natural scavengers with a knack for escaping tricky situations. Medieval torturers used this to their advantage by devising rat torture as a gruesome method of punishment for criminals. Rat torture involves placing a metal cage of rats on the victim's belly. From there, the torturers apply fire to the cage, gradually heating it. Naturally, the rats will be compelled to try to escape as the cage becomes hot enough to cook them. Unfortunately for the victim, the softest target happens to be their belly. The rats chewed their way through the victim's belly to escape being cooked alive. It's already painful enough for rodents to bite and claw through skin and flesh, but the pain reaches new heights when the rats chew their way through organs to create an exit through the person's body. Iron Maiden. At first glance, the Iron Maiden looks like a harmless metal coffin designed to have a woman's face. But nobody wants to end up inside this Maiden. From the outside, it just looked like any old box. But inside, it was lined with spikes, turning it into something straight out of your worst nightmares. Getting squeezed by this thing was like being hugged by a cactus from all angles. Once someone was locked inside, they were left to scream in agony as those spikes slowly pierced through their skin and flesh. And here's the messed up part: the spikes were strategically placed to avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim's suffering was prolonged. Whoever came up with this had to have a seriously twisted mind, and a disturbingly detailed knowledge of human anatomy. There are tales of Iron Maiden gadgets from the 19th century, but whether they were widely used in medieval times is still being determined. Some say it's just a myth, as little solid evidence supports their widespread use. But either way, it's a chilling reminder of how dark history can be. Branding. Animals weren't the only things branded during the medieval period. It's got a pretty grim history involving people. Centuries ago, authorities would sear a hot iron onto their skin instead of slapping fines or jail time on wrongdoers. But the pain wasn't even the worst part. See, once branded, you were marked for life. It wasn't about killing you, instead it was about humiliating you forever. Imagine having this visible mark, broadcasting to everyone that you messed up. It was like a social death. You couldn't make friends or form relationships because nobody wanted to be associated with a branded criminal. Branding wasn't for minor stuff either, because it was reserved for serious crimes like forgery, theft, or adultery. And living as a branded outcast forever might have been even worse than death. Cement shoes. You might have heard about cement shoes from when mobsters ruled the streets, from the saying, sleeping with the fishes, where you literally are made to go to sleep with the fish at the bottom of the sea or lake. Surprisingly, they weren't just about punishment. Instead, they were more of a method of making someone vanish without a trace. The punishment involves filling a pair of shoes with wet concrete and forcing the victim to wear them. Then they toss them into a body of water. As the concrete sets, it essentially turns the victim into a permanent fixture on the ocean floor.